The desert stretched out like an endless ocean of sand and rock under the merciless Afghan sun. Staff Sergeant Maya wiped the sweat from her brow as she adjusted the scope on her rifle. She had been deployed to this remote outpost for 3 months now, working alongside a team of Navy SEALs as part of a special operations task force. Maya was one of the few female snipers in the military, a fact that had earned her both respect and skepticism throughout her career. The morning started like any other. The team gathered in the briefing room, a cramped space with maps plastered across every wall. Lieutenant Commander James stood at the front, his weathered face showing the strain of too many missions and too little sleep. He pointed to a location on the map, a small village nestled in a valley about 15 miles from their position. Intelligence reports had indicated that a high-value target was hiding in the village. This wasn't just any target. Was responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed dozens of coalition forces and hundreds of Afghan civilians. The mission was straightforward on paper: insert a team, locate the target, and extract before enemy forces could respond. But Maya had learned long ago that nothing in this war-torn country was ever straightforward. The team consisted of 8 Navy SEALs and Maya. Each man was a veteran of countless operations, their faces hardened by years of combat. They moved with the kind of efficiency that only comes from training together through the worst situations imaginable. Maya had worked with this team before, and they had come to trust her abilities completely. In their world, trust wasn't given freely. It was earned through blood, sweat, and the ability to keep your teammates alive when everything went wrong. They loaded into 2 helicopters just before dawn. The birds lifted off, their rotors cutting through the cool morning air. Maya sat near the door, her rifle resting across her lap. She could see the landscape changing below them as they flew deeper into Taliban territory. The green zone near the river gave way to brown mountains and rocky terrain that offered 1,000 hiding places for anyone who knew the land. The helicopters dropped them 3 miles from the village. The moment her boots hit the ground, Maya was scanning them through her scope. The team moved out in formation, each member knowing their role without needing to speak. Communication happened through hand signals and the occasional whisper over the radio. They moved like shadows, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. 2 hours of careful movement brought them to an overwatch position above the village. Maya set up her rifle on a small ridge that gave her a clear view of the entire area. She could see people moving through the streets below, going about their morning routines. Children played in the dirt while women carried water from the well. It looked peaceful, almost normal, but Maya knew better than to trust appearances. The SEALs split into 2 teams. One would enter the village from the north while the other provided security from the south. Maya's job was to watch everything from above, providing early warning and covering fire if needed. She settled into position, her eye pressed against the scope as she began the methodical process of scanning every building, every alley, every potential threat. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the rocks around her into an oven. Maya barely noticed. She was focused entirely on the village below, watching for any sign that their presence had been detected. The radio crackled occasionally with brief updates from the teams below. They were moving through the village systematically, clearing houses one by one. Then everything changed in an instant. The radio erupted with urgent voices. The team had found their target, but they weren't alone. Enemy fighters had been waiting, turning the target house into an ambush. Gunfire erupted in the village below. Maya could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions. The SEALs were pinned down, caught in a deadly crossfire. She immediately began identifying targets through her scope. Fighters were appearing from buildings all around the SEAL team, emerging from positions they must have prepared in advance. This wasn't a random encounter. The enemy had known they were coming. Maya's mind raced as she calculated distances and wind speed, making the tiny adjustments that separated a hit from a miss at this range. Her first shot dropped a fighter who had been moving to flank the SEAL team from the east. The crack of her rifle echoed across the valley. She didn't wait to confirm the kill. Her training took over as she smoothly transitioned to the next target, a man with an RPG who was taking aim at the house where half the SEAL team had taken cover. Her second shot caught him in the chest just as he was about to fire. The RPG clattered to the ground unfired. But more fighters kept appearing. Maya could see them now, at least 30 men moving through the village with the coordination of a well-trained force. These weren't the usual Taliban fighters. They moved with purpose and discipline, using proper cover and fire maneuvers. The SEALs were outnumbered and surrounded in a village that had turned into a killing zone. Lieutenant's voice came over the radio, tense but controlled. They were requesting immediate extraction, but Maya could hear the doubt in his voice. The nearest support was at least 20 minutes away. In a firefight like this, 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. The team needed help now, and Maya was the only one in position to provide it. She forced herself to breathe slowly, methodically, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Her third shot took down a fighter who was throwing a grenade toward the SEAL position. The grenade exploded harmlessly in an empty street. Fourth shot, fifth shot, each one carefully placed to remove the most immediate threats to her teammates below. The enemy fighters began to realize they were taking fire from the ridge. Several of them started shooting in her direction, but Maya had chosen her position well. The rocks around her provided excellent cover, and at this range, hitting a single target with an assault rifle was nearly impossible. She used their distraction to her advantage, continuing to pick off fighters one by one. Through her scope, Maya watched as the SEAL team tried to fight their way out of the trap. They were moving in short bounds, two men providing covering fire while others advanced. It was textbook infantry tactics, but the sheer number of enemy fighters made every move dangerous. She could see one of the SEALs go down, hit in the leg. His teammates immediately pulled him into cover, but now they had a wounded man to protect. Maya shifted her focus to the fighters who posed the greatest threat to the wounded SEAL. A group of 3 men was trying to work their way around to that position, using a series of mud walls for cover. She waited patiently, her crosshairs steady on the gap they would have to cross. When the first man moved, she fired. He dropped instantly. The second man froze, uncertain whether to continue or retreat. Maya made the decision for him with her next shot. The third man wisely chose to stay behind the wall. The radio chatter was constant now. The SEALs were calling out targets, coordinating their movements, and trying to find a way out of the ambush. Maya heard order a withdrawal toward a compound on the western edge of the village. It was larger than the other buildings, with thick walls that could provide better protection. But getting there meant crossing 50 meters of open ground while under fire from multiple positions. Maya understood what needed to happen. She needed to suppress enough of the enemy fire to give her teammates a chance to move. She began firing more rapidly now, not taking the time to confirm each kill before moving to the next target. Her goal was to keep the enemy fighters pinned down, to make them think twice before exposing themselves to shoot at the retreating SEALs. Her rifle grew hot under her hands as she fired shot after shot. She could see the SEAL team making their move, running in pairs toward the compound. Bullets kicked up dust all around them, but they were moving fast, using every bit of cover available. Maya kept firing, her scope moving from one target to the next with practiced precision. One of the SEALs stumbled and went down. For a horrifying moment, Maya thought he had been hit, but he was back on his feet a second later, helped up by his teammate. They disappeared into the compound, and Maya allowed herself a brief moment of relief. They had made it to better cover, but they were still surrounded and trapped. The enemy fighters weren't giving up. Maya could see them reorganizing, gathering in larger groups to assault the compound. She realized with growing dread that the situation was getting worse, not better. The fighters knew the SEALs were pinned down and wounded. They would keep up the pressure until support arrived or until they overran the position. Maya checked her ammunition. She had gone through nearly half of what she carried. At this rate, she would run out long before the situation was resolved. She needed to make every shot count to prioritize the targets that posed the greatest threat. She took a deep breath and settled back into her scope, pushing aside her fatigue and fear. The sun was directly overhead now, beating down with relentless intensity. Maya watched through her scope as approximately 15 fighters gathered behind a series of walls about 100 meters from the compound where the SEAL team was trapped. They were preparing for a major push, and she could see one man who appeared to be their leader gesturing and giving orders. Taking him out might disrupt their coordination, at least temporarily. She adjusted her aim, compensating for the slight breeze that had picked up. The leader was partially hidden behind a wall, only his head and shoulders visible. It was a difficult shot, but Maya had made harder ones before. She exhaled slowly, let her body relax, and squeezed the trigger. The man dropped instantly, and the fighters around him scattered in confusion. But the confusion didn't last long. Another man quickly took charge, and the assault continued. Maya realized she was fighting a losing battle. No matter how many she took down, there seemed to be more waiting to take their place. The enemy had reinforcements arriving, while her team had nowhere to go and no additional support for at least another 15 minutes. His voice came over the radio again. He was calling for an on the village, danger close to their own position. It was a desperate move, but Maya understood why he was making it. If they couldn't break out of the trap, they would eventually be overrun. Better to risk friendly fire from aircraft than face certain death at the hands of the enemy fighters surrounding them. The response from command was not what they wanted to hear. All available air support was committed to another operation on the other side of the province. The earliest they could get a plane overhead was 45 minutes. His response was short and professional, but Maya could hear the strain in his voice. 45 minutes might as well be an eternity. Maya made a decision. She couldn't stay in her current position and provide effective support. The angle was wrong, and there were too many dead spaces where she couldn't see enemy fighters moving. She needed to get closer to find a position where she could cover more of the village and put more effective fire on the attackers. It was risky. Moving would expose her and might compromise her position entirely, but staying where she was meant watching her teammates die. She quickly gathered her gear and began moving down the ridge, using the terrain to mask her movement from the village below. Every step was calculated, every piece of cover evaluated. She moved in short rushes, always keeping her rifle ready in case she was spotted. The weight of her equipment felt heavier than usual, each pound a burden in the oppressive heat. It took her 10 minutes to reach a new position, a rocky outcrop about 500 meters from the compound. It was closer than she liked to be as a sniper, but it gave her a much better view of the village and the enemy positions. She quickly set up her rifle, using her pack as a rest, and began scanning for targets. The situation had deteriorated while she was moving. The enemy fighters had pressed closer to the compound, and the volume of incoming fire had increased dramatically. Maya could see the mud walls of the compound being chewed apart by bullets. The SEALs were returning fire, but they were running low on ammunition. Every shot had to count. Maya went to work with renewed urgency. From this position, she could see fighters that had been hidden before, men who were directing fire from covered positions. She began systematically eliminating them, starting with those who posed the greatest threat. Her rifle barked repeatedly, each shot carefully aimed and placed. She took down a machine gunner who had set up on a rooftop, giving him a clear field of fire into the compound. The machine gun went silent, giving the SEALs a brief respite from that direction. Next was a fighter with another RPG, this one trying to line up a shot through a window of the compound. Maya's bullet caught him just as he was shouldering the weapon, and it fell from his hands. But being closer also made her more vulnerable. Enemy fighters had spotted the muzzle flash from her rifle, and now bullets were snapping past her position. She heard the distinctive crack of rounds breaking the sound barrier near her head, followed by the impact of bullets on the rocks around her. She forced herself to remain calm, to keep breathing steadily and taking careful shots. A bullet struck the rock just inches from her face, showering her with sharp fragments that stung her cheek. She felt a warm trickle of blood but ignored it. There was no time to worry about minor injuries. She shifted slightly to her left, finding a new firing position behind a different rock, and continued engaging targets. Through her scope, Maya saw one of the SEALs lean out from cover to throw a grenade. He was exposed for just a second, but it was enough. An enemy fighter fired, and the SEAL jerked backward. Maya's heart sank. She couldn't tell how badly he was hurt, but the team now had at least 2 wounded men, possibly more. The radio traffic was becoming more urgent. The SEALs were discussing options, none of them good. They couldn't stay where they were much longer. The building was being shot to pieces around them, and they were almost out of ammunition. But breaking out meant crossing open ground while outnumbered and under fire with wounded men who couldn't move quickly. Maya made another decision, one that went against every bit of her training. She got on the radio and proposed a plan. If the SEAL team could make a run for a wadi, a dry riverbed about 200 meters east of their position, she would provide covering fire and draw as much enemy attention as possible. It was suicide for her, but it might give the team a chance to escape. His response was immediate and forceful. Absolutely not. They would find another way. But Maya knew there was no other way. She had seen the tactical situation from above. She understood the geography and the enemy positions better than anyone. If the team tried to break out without something to distract the enemy fighters, they would be cut down before they made it 50 meters. She didn't argue. Instead, she simply said she was moving to a better position and would provide support for their withdrawal. Before could respond, she was already moving again, working her way even closer to the village. She could hear his voice calling her over the radio, but she ignored it. Some decisions couldn't be made by committee. Maya found exactly what she was looking for. A small building on the edge of the village, partially collapsed but with a second story that was still intact. It was practically on top of the enemy positions, so close she could hear the fighters shouting to each other. From there, she would have a clear view of almost the entire village and could cover the SEAL team's escape route. Getting to the building meant crossing 30 meters of open ground in full view of enemy positions. She waited for the right moment when the volume of fire seemed to lull slightly. Then she ran, her legs pumping as hard as they could, her gear bouncing against her body. She heard shouts behind her and the crack of bullets, but she didn't slow down. She hit the wall of the building at full speed, using her momentum to carry her through a doorway. Inside, she found a partially collapsed staircase. It looked unstable, but it was her only way up. She climbed carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. The wood creaked ominously, but it held. She reached the second floor and immediately moved to a window facing the compound where the SEALs were trapped. From this position, she had an incredible view. She could see enemy fighters in positions that had been completely hidden before. More importantly, she could cover the route to the wadi where the SEAL team could find safety. She set up her rifle, bracing it on the window frame, and got back on the radio. She told she was in position and ready to cover their withdrawal. There was a long pause, and she could imagine the conversation happening in that compound. The SEAL team leader would be furious at her for disobeying, but he would also recognize that her position gave them their best chance of survival. When he finally responded, his voice was tight with emotion, but his words were professional. They would move on her mark. Maya took one last look at her surroundings. The building could collapse at any moment. She was surrounded by enemy fighters who would tear her apart if they found her. She had maybe 60 rounds of ammunition left. The odds of her surviving the next 10 minutes were close to zero. But those 8 men in that compound were her brothers. They had bled together, fought together, and trusted their lives to each other. If her death could buy their survival, it was a trade she would make without hesitation. She radioed that she was ready, counted down from 3. On his mark, the SEAL team burst from the compound, moving in a tight formation with the wounded men in the middle. At the same moment, Maya opened fire, shooting as fast as she could acquire targets. Her rifle became an extension of her will, each shot precisely placed to eliminate threats or force enemy fighters to take cover. The enemy fighters were caught completely off guard. They had been focused on the compound, expecting the SEALs to try to hold out until reinforcements arrived. Now they were suddenly taking accurate fire from their flank, and their targets were running in an unexpected direction. The confusion bought the SEAL team precious seconds. Maya saw a fighter pop up with an RPG aimed at the fleeing SEALs. She shot him before he could fire. Another fighter was drawing a bead with a rifle, and she took him down as well. Her world narrowed to the view through her scope, the feel of the trigger under her finger, and the steady rhythm of breathing and shooting that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. The SEAL team was halfway to the wadi when the enemy fighters realized what was happening and began to recover from their surprise. Fire intensified from multiple positions, all of it now directed at the running men. Maya redoubled her efforts, shooting faster, barely taking time to aim. She could see bullets kicking up dirt all around the SEAL team, but they kept moving, kept fighting. Then she saw him. A fighter with an RPG had emerged from a building directly in line with the SEAL team's route. He was shouldering the weapon, and at this range, he couldn't miss. Maya swung her rifle toward him, but she was too slow. She saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw the rocket motor ignite. In that split second, Maya did something she had never done before. She stood up fully, exposing herself in the window, and screamed at the top of her lungs. The fighter heard her. His head turned, his aim shifted slightly as he reacted to the unexpected noise. The rocket streaked out, missing the SEAL team by meters and exploding harmlessly against a wall. But standing up had made Maya visible to every fighter in the village. Bullets immediately began tearing through the window where she stood. She dropped flat as rounds smashed into the wall above her, showering her with debris. The wooden floor beneath her splintered as bullets punched through from below. The entire building shook, and she realized with cold certainty that it was about to come down. Maya grabbed her rifle and scrambled toward what remained of the staircase. She could hear the enemy fighters entering the building below, their voices angry and excited. They knew they had her cornered. She looked down the stairwell and saw that the wooden steps had been completely destroyed by gunfire. There was no way down except a straight drop of about 12 feet onto a floor covered in rubble and broken wood. She didn't hesitate. Maya jumped, tucking and rolling as she hit the ground. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself to keep moving. She could see daylight through a hole in the far wall where the building had partially collapsed. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was her only option. Behind her, she heard boots pounding on the floor above and voices shouting. The enemy fighters had reached the second floor and realized she was no longer there. Maya threw herself at the hole in the wall, scraping her shoulders and back on the rough edges as she squeezed through. She landed in a narrow alley between buildings, temporarily out of sight of her pursuers. Her radio crackled. His voice, breathless from running, reported that the team had made it to the wadi and were in cover. He was asking for her status, but Maya couldn't answer. Speaking would give away her position to the fighters who were now pouring out of the building she had just escaped. She turned off her radio and focused on survival. The alley was a maze of mud walls and narrow passages. Maya moved through it as quickly as she could manage on her injured ankle, which was already swelling inside her boot. She could hear the enemy fighters spreading out, searching for her. They were calling to each other, coordinating their hunt. She was being herded, pushed in a specific direction, and she realized too late that it was deliberate. She emerged from the alley into a small courtyard and found herself face to face with 3 enemy fighters. They were as surprised as she was. For a frozen moment, everyone simply stared. Then training took over. Maya brought her rifle up and fired from the hip, not taking time to aim. The first fighter went down. She worked the bolt and fired again, hitting the second man in the shoulder. The third fighter recovered faster than she expected. He swung his AK-47 toward her, and Maya knew she wouldn't be able to work the bolt and fire again before he pulled the trigger. Instead, she rushed forward, using her rifle to knock his weapon aside. They collided hard, and both went down in a tangle of limbs and weapons. Maya had trained extensively in hand-to-hand combat, but training was different from the real thing. The fighter was stronger than her, and he was fighting with the desperation of a man who knew only one of them was leaving this courtyard alive. They rolled across the dirt, each trying to gain the upper hand. Maya felt his hands close around her throat, cutting off her air. Her vision started to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. With the last of her strength, Maya drove her thumb into the fighter's eye. He screamed and released his grip. She gasped for air and rolled away, grabbing for her sidearm. Her hands found the pistol grip just as the fighter recovered and lunged at her again. She fired twice at point-blank range, and he collapsed on top of her. Maya shoved the body aside and struggled to her feet. Her throat was on fire and she could barely breathe. Blood from the dead fighter covered her uniform. She retrieved her rifle, checked it for damage, and tried to get her bearings. She could hear more fighters approaching from multiple directions. The sounds of the firefight had drawn them like moths to a flame. She limped out of the courtyard through another narrow passage, her injured ankle screaming with every step. Her mind was working frantically, trying to figure out how to get out of the village alive. She was cut off from the SEAL team, surrounded by hostile fighters, low on ammunition, and injured. The tactical situation was about as bad as it could get. Then she heard something that changed everything. The deep, powerful sound of helicopter rotors, getting louder by the second. She risked turning her radio back on and heard his voice coordinating with the incoming birds. The extraction helicopters had arrived early, pulled from another mission when command heard the situation had gone critical. But the helicopters couldn't land in the village. It was too hot, too many fighters with weapons. They were setting down in the wadi where the SEAL team had taken cover, about 400 meters from Maya's current position. She looked in that direction and saw nothing but open ground and enemy fighters between her and safety. His voice came over the radio, calling for her. The helicopters were on the ground, but they couldn't wait long. They would take fire any second. The SEAL team was loaded and ready to go. They just needed her. She had 30 seconds, maybe less, to make it to those helicopters or be left behind. Maya made her decision. She burst from cover and ran toward the wadi with every ounce of strength she had left. Her injured ankle gave way on the first step, and she nearly fell, but she caught herself and kept going. Behind her, enemy fighters shouted and opened fire. Bullets cracked past her head and kicked up dirt at her feet. She didn't run in a straight line. That would be suicide. Instead, she zigzagged, using every bit of cover available, even though it meant adding distance to her run. A bullet tugged at her sleeve. Another hit her backpack with enough force to spin her halfway around. She kept her feet and kept running. The helicopters were taking fire now. She could see tracers arcing toward them and the door gunners returning fire with there. The roar of the engines was deafening. Maya could see the SEAL team in the open doors of the lead bird reaching out toward her, shouting encouragement she couldn't hear over the noise. She was close, so close, 50 meters, 40. Her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead weights. 30 meters, 20. She could see his face clearly now, his hand extended toward her. 10 meters. A bullet hit her rifle, tearing it from her grasp and spinning her around. She stumbled but didn't fall. 5 meters. Hands grabbed her, strong hands that lifted her bodily off the ground and pulled her into the helicopter. She landed hard on the metal floor as the bird lifted off, taking fire from every direction. The door gunners kept firing as they climbed, suppressing the enemy fighters below. Maya lay on the floor, gasping for breath, barely able to believe she was alive. Was kneeling beside her, checking her for injuries. His lips were moving, but she couldn't hear him over the noise of the helicopter and the ringing in her ears. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain flared through her ankle, her ribs, her throat. She had cuts and bruises everywhere, but she was alive, and so was her team. As the helicopter gained altitude and distance from the village, the volume of fire decreased and eventually stopped. Maya finally allowed herself to relax, to let the adrenaline drain away. One of the team medics was working on her ankle, wrapping it tightly. Another was cleaning the cuts on her face and checking her pupils for signs of concussion. She looked around at the faces of the SEAL team. Every one of them was looking at her with expressions she had never seen before. It wasn't just respect or gratitude. It was something deeper, a bond forged in the fire of combat. These men had seen her risk everything to save them, had watched her fight against impossible odds and somehow come through alive. Leaned close to her ear so she could hear him over the noise. He told her that she had saved their lives. Without her covering fire, they never would have made it out of that compound. Her actions in that village were beyond anything he had seen in 20 years of combat. He was putting her in for a medal, the highest one he could justify. Maya just shook her head. She hadn't done it for medals or recognition. She had done it because those men were her brothers and you didn't leave your brothers behind. It was that simple. The fact that she had survived was more reward than she needed. The flight back to base took 20 minutes. Maya spent most of it with her eyes closed, trying to process everything that had happened. The fear, the pain, the absolute certainty that she was going to die in that village. But more than that, she thought about the moments when everything had clicked, when her training and instinct had merged perfectly, when every shot had gone exactly where she intended. When the helicopters touched down at base, there was a crowd waiting. Word of the mission had spread, and everyone wanted to see the team that had survived such a close call. Maya was helped out of the helicopter by two of the SEALs, her arm draped over their shoulders because she couldn't walk on her injured ankle. The base commander was there, along with several other senior officers. They wanted a debrief immediately, while the events were still fresh. Maya sat in a chair in the operations center, her ankle elevated, and recounted everything that had happened from the moment they had inserted until the extraction. She spoke in a flat, professional tone, sticking to facts and avoiding any embellishment. But the SEAL team members filled in the details she left out. They described watching her methodically take down enemy fighters one after another, how she had held off an entire village of hostiles by herself, how she had risked everything to draw fire away from them during their escape. They told the commander that without her, none of them would be sitting in this room. The intelligence officers wanted to know everything about the enemy fighters. The coordination and numbers suggested something more organized than the usual Taliban cell. Maya described what she had seen, how they moved and communicated. It painted a picture of a well-trained force, possibly foreign fighters with military experience. The mission might have failed to capture the target, but the intelligence gathered would be valuable for future operations. After the debrief, Maya was taken to the medical facility. The doctors wanted to keep her overnight for observation. Her ankle was badly sprained but not broken. She had multiple contusions, lacerations, and a mild concussion. Her throat was bruised from being choked, and she would have difficulty speaking normally for several days. Overall, given what she had been through, her injuries were remarkably minor. She lay in the hospital bed, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that village, running through the streets, feeling bullets snap past her head. She kept thinking about all the moments when things could have gone differently, when a bullet could have been an inch to the left or right and ended everything. Came to visit her the next morning. He pulled up a chair beside her bed and sat in silence for a moment before speaking. He told her that he had been in combat for 2 decades, had seen incredible acts of courage and sacrifice. But what she had done in that village was on another level entirely. She had single-handedly held off 30 enemy fighters, saved 8 men's lives, and made it out alive against all odds. Maya tried to downplay it, to say she had just been doing her job, but wasn't having it. He made her understand that what happened in that village would be studied in military academies, that her tactics and decisions would be used to train future generations of special operations soldiers. She had done something truly extraordinary. He also told her about the aftermath. The enemy fighters had suffered heavy casualties, with at least 15 confirmed kills, most of them attributed to Maya's shooting. The village had been thoroughly searched after and intelligence had found evidence of a major enemy command post. The mission might not have captured the high-value target, but it had significantly disrupted enemy operations in the region. Over the following weeks, as Maya recovered from her injuries, the story of what happened in that village spread throughout the military community. She became something of a legend, though she was uncomfortable with the attention. Other female soldiers looked up to her as proof that women could perform at the highest levels of combat. The SEAL community, traditionally closed and skeptical of outsiders, fully accepted her as one of their own. The medal ceremony took place 2 months later. Maya stood in her dress uniform, her ankle fully healed but still stiff on cold mornings. She received the Silver Star for her actions that day, one of the highest awards for valor in combat. The citation recounted her actions in detail, how she had engaged 30 enemy fighters, provided covering fire that enabled her team to escape, and fought her way through a hostile village to reach extraction. But the moment that meant the most to Maya came after the ceremony. The 8 members of the SEAL team she had saved gathered around her. They had pooled their money to buy her a gift, a custom-made knife with her name engraved on the blade along with the date of the mission. Presented it to her and told her it was a symbol of their bond, forged in the mountains of Afghanistan under enemy fire. He told her that every one of them owed their lives to her courage and skill. They would carry the memory of what she did for the rest of their lives. If she ever needed anything, anywhere, anytime, all she had to do was call. The Brotherhood of Special Operations soldiers was exclusive and hard-earned, but she had earned her place in it beyond any doubt. Maya returned home at the end of her deployment a different person than when she left. She had proven to herself and others that she could perform under the most extreme pressure imaginable. She had faced death and survived through a combination of skill, training, and sheer determination. But more importantly, she had learned what it truly meant to be part of a team, to trust your life to others and have them trust theirs to you. She continued her career in the military, taking on increasingly challenging assignments. She trained other snipers, sharing the lessons she had learned in that Afghan village. She became an advocate for women in combat roles, speaking about her experiences and encouraging others to push past the barriers that still existed. But she never forgot that day in the village. It had changed her fundamentally, shaped her understanding of courage, sacrifice, and what humans are capable of when everything is on the line. The faces of those 8 SEALs were burned into her memory, a constant reminder of why she had chosen this life and what truly mattered. Years later, Maya would sometimes be asked if she was scared during those hours pinned down on that ridge and in that village. She always answered honestly. Of course she was scared. Fear is the natural human response to mortal danger, but fear doesn't have to control you. It can be acknowledged, accepted, and then set aside while you do what needs to be done. She would tell young soldiers that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is being terrified and still pulling the trigger, still running toward danger instead of away from it, still standing up when everything in your body is screaming at you to hide. That's what she had done in that village, and that's what she hoped she had taught others through her example. The mission that day had been a failure in some ways. They hadn't captured their target, and the enemy had been waiting for them. But in another, more important way, it had been a profound success. 8 men who would have died came home to their families. A team that had been tested to the breaking point had held together and survived. And a young woman from California had proven that when the bullets start flying, what matters isn't gender or background or politics, but simply courage, skill, and a willingness to sacrifice for your brothers in arms. Maya kept the knife the SEALs had given her in a place of honor in her home. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would take it out and remember that day. She would think about all the small decisions and moments of chance that had determined who lived and who died. She would remember the weight of the rifle in her hands, the heat of the Afghan sun, the sound of bullets cracking through the air around her. But most of all, she would remember the faces of her team as they pulled her into that helicopter, the mixture of relief and pride and something deeper that couldn't quite be put into words. That was what made everything worthwhile. Not the medals or the recognition, but the knowledge that when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, she had been exactly where she needed to be and done exactly what needed to be done. The story of what happened in that Afghan village became part of military history. It was studied and analyzed, broken down into tactical lessons and strategic insights. But for Maya and the men she served with that day, it would always be something more personal. It was the day they learned what they were truly capable of, the day bonds were forged that would last a lifetime, and the day they all came home when they shouldn't have. Maya eventually retired from the military after 15 years of service. She settled into civilian life, though she remained connected to the military community through veteran organizations and speaking engagements. She married, started a family, and built a life far removed from the dangers she had once faced daily. But a part of her would always be that young sniper on a ridge in Afghanistan, looking through her scope at impossible odds and refusing to back down. The 8 men whose lives she saved that day stayed in touch. They gathered every year on the anniversary of the mission, sharing memories and supporting each other through the challenges that come with life after combat. They brought their families, introduced their children, and kept alive the story of what had happened and what it meant. At those gatherings, they would always raise a toast to Maya, thanking her once again for what she had done. And she would always respond the same way, raising her glass and saying that she had simply done what any of them would have done in her position. It was about brotherhood, about never leaving anyone behind, about being worthy of the trust that others placed in you. That was the real lesson of that day in the Afghan village. Not that one person could defeat 30 through superior skill or courage, but that people bound together by loyalty and shared purpose can accomplish things that seem impossible. When you know that your teammates would die for you, and you would die for them, it changes everything. It gives you strength beyond what you thought you had, courage beyond what you thought you could summon. Maya understood now why the special operations community was so tight-knit, so protective of its own. They had all been through experiences that civilians could never truly understand, had faced situations where the wrong decision meant death, where a moment's hesitation could cost lives. They had learned to trust each other completely because survival depended on it. She also understood the weight of that trust. Every decision she made in combat affected not just her own fate, but the fate of her teammates. That responsibility was heavier than any equipment she carried, more burdensome than any injury she sustained. It was what kept her awake on quiet nights, replaying decisions and wondering if she had done everything she could. But she also knew that she had passed the test. When everything went wrong, when the odds were stacked impossibly against them, when death seemed certain, she had found a way. She had kept her head, made good decisions, and brought everyone home. That knowledge gave her confidence and peace, a foundation she could build the rest of her life on. The scars from that day never fully faded. The physical ones were minor, barely noticeable. But the psychological scars ran deeper. She still had dreams about running through that village, still felt her heart race when she heard sudden loud noises. She learned to manage it, to recognize the symptoms of trauma and deal with them constructively. She was open about her struggles, refusing to pretend that combat didn't leave marks on everyone who experienced it. She became an advocate for better mental health support for veterans, speaking candidly about her own journey and encouraging others to seek help when they needed it. Strength, she learned, wasn't about never breaking down. It was about putting yourself back together afterward and helping others do the same. Looking back on her military career years later, Maya could see how that single day had defined so much of what came after. It had given her credibility and respect that opened doors, allowed her to take on leadership roles and influence policy. But more than that, it had taught her what she was capable of, both physically and mentally. She had learned that she could function under extreme stress, that her training would hold even when tested to its limits, that she could make life-or-death decisions without falling apart. She had learned the true meaning of sacrifice, of putting others before yourself, of being willing to die so that your teammates could live. These weren't abstract concepts anymore but lived experiences, memories seared into her consciousness. As she told her story to young soldiers and veterans groups, Maya always emphasized that she wasn't special or uniquely talented. She was simply someone who had trained hard, stayed focused when it mattered, and refused to quit even when quitting seemed like the only rational option. Anyone could do what she did if they were willing to put in the work and make the commitment. But she also acknowledged that not everyone would face a test like the one she faced in that village. Most soldiers served honorably without ever experiencing combat that intense. That didn't make their service less valuable or their sacrifice less meaningful. Everyone contributed in their own way, and the military couldn't function without all of its parts working together. The legacy of that day lived on in multiple ways. The tactical lessons were incorporated into training programs. The story was used to illustrate points about courage, decision-making under pressure, and the importance of never giving up. Female soldiers saw it as proof that they could compete and excel at the highest levels of military service. But for Maya personally, the most important legacy was simpler. She had been tested in the crucible of combat and had not been found wanting. She had saved the lives of 8 good men who went on to live full lives, to have families and careers and futures they would have been without her actions. That knowledge sustained her through difficult times and gave meaning to the sacrifices she had made. She knew that many people who heard her story focused on the dramatic elements, the narrow escapes and incredible shooting. But the real story, the one that mattered, was about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. It was about training and discipline overcoming fear and chaos. It was about the bonds formed between warriors that transcended everything else. In the end, Maya's story wasn't just about a single firefight in an Afghan village. It was about dedication, sacrifice, and what it means to truly be part of something larger than yourself. It was about pushing past limits you thought were absolute and finding reserves of strength you didn't know existed. Most of all, it was about people taking care of each other in the darkest moments, when the stakes couldn't be higher and failure wasn't an option. She crawled to the opposite side of the room, away from the window as the building groaned and swayed. Through the gaps in the floor, she could see enemy fighters rushing toward her position. They knew she was here now and they were coming for her. She had maybe 30 seconds before they reached her was soaked with sweat, and her mouth was dry as sand. But she ignored the discomfort, focusing entirely on the scene below. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters moving toward the compound in a coordinated assault. They were getting bolder, more aggressive. Time was running out.